Today we will be discussing the historical ties between China and Japan, starting with the Ming Dynasty and Edo period, then the Qing and Meiji eras, and finally the democratization of both nations. Without further delay, let's begin. One thing to note is that in this time period, most, though not all, large countries had hereditary leadership. The problem is, however, that a single family seems to not be able to control a country with real authority for more than half a millennium or so. China and Japan handled this in two very different ways. In China, religion was used to say actually if a dynasty gets overthrown, that's a good thing. That's what the universe wants. So China has had many different dynasties over the years. The Ming Dynasty was the dynasty between 1368 and 1644, when Europe started to interact with East Asia more. China was more willing to change. However, Japan, which seems to not like governmental change, had a different strategy. In order to avoid changing the dynasty, they simply redefined the emperor to a ceremonial religious figure, which is what has let the same family rule for nearly 2,000 years. However, the shogun had the real governmental authority, the Tokugawa family being the true inheritors of legal authority between 1603 and 1868. Initially, China even wanted to explore the world and sent a Muslim-born explorer Zheng He to do very similar things to the sailors of Europe, and later they would have largely good ties to Portugal compared to what occurred in China. However, Japan seemed to simply want to be left alone. Initially, they agreed to deals with the Spanish and Portuguese, but immediately once they got the power to do so, they created a very limited system of only allowing the Dutch to trade with them at a specific port. After the Ming Dynasty came the Qing Dynasty, and the Qing Dynasty started out very strong, at one point having the most total land China ever had in its history. However, there were some problems. The Qing Dynasty is called the last Chinese dynasty for a reason. Firstly, the Qing dynasty was not considered ethnically Chinese at the time, as they were Manchus. And this would start a trend of the Chinese thinking that they were being controlled by outsiders who were not Han Chinese. Perhaps this is why the Japanese put so much emphasis on avoiding external influence and being led by ethnically Japanese individuals. While it is good to want self-control and to avoid unfair imperialism, naturally this viewpoint could also lead to very evil acts and severe racism, and it did. During the 19th century, something occurred that no Chinese citizen ever thought would occur. Japan began to outmaneuver and become more powerful than China. During the Meiji period, Japan decided, for better or for worse, that the way they would preserve their culture is by behaving legally like a European nation. For instance, replacing the shogun with a prime minister, but remaining ethnically Japanese. China was increasingly having trouble keeping up with European technology, badly losing the Opium Wars and feeling as though Europe only saw them as a place to sell drugs. They were forced to sign multiple unequal treaties, the most famous of which gave Europe Hong Kong, whereas Japan used trade with the United States to rapidly increase their development. They conquered major former Chinese territories such as Taiwan and Korea after the Sino-Japanese War. China had multiple conflicts with Christianity as well. Famously, during the Taiping Rebellion, where Hong Xiuquan famously called himself the brother of Jesus Christ, and later the Boxer Rebellion, which was an anti-Christian rebellion violently put down by an eight-nation alliance which included Japan. In the early 20th century, Japan was even seen as equal to Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. During the early 20th century, Europe was becoming more democratic. China and Japan both attempted to do the same and both failed. The increasing ineffectiveness of not just the Qing dynasty, but the Chinese dynasty system as a whole, leading to the last emperor of China being overthrown in favor of the Republic of China in 1911, led by Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang, tried to reform every part of Chinese society. Sun Yat-sen had hoped to make a democracy with the military leader of the previous government, Yuan Shikai, as the president. However, Yuan quickly betrayed Sun by calling himself the new emperor, after which he was overthrown and China went through many different leaders, ultimately leading to the Republic becoming very weak in comparison to the regions of China. Though this leaves us on a bit of a cliffhanger, this concludes the period of time in Chinese and Japanese history that this presentation was going to explore. I do want to add a few more cultural points before I am done. Buddhism traveled from China to Japan, and initially Japan heavily relied on Chinese ideas, but over this time frame created its own unique Buddhism independent of China. Nichiren Buddhism exemplifies this perfectly, going from a largely Chinese philosophy centered around the Chinese book The Lotus Sutra. Today it is largely led by Japanese monks and considered the most Japanese of all the forms of Buddhism. China used to be the main location of trade with Europe, but during this period, increasingly China only became a trade partner for its sheer size. But Japan became seen as the nation with the quality products. Finally, China was the main hub for art and storytelling, whereas Japan would take over this industry. This would become important later. With that, we have discussed the Ming and Edo periods, the Qing and Meiji periods, and the democratization periods of both countries.